So our focus on refugee host communities, I think, is important because it challenges the frequent depiction and assumption that it is active citizens, NGOs and states which provide assistance to passive refugees. And instead, we've been centralising the role both of local communities, but also of refugee communities as providers of assistance, of solidarity and of support. So although there's often the assumption that refugees will be most vulnerable immediately after being displaced and that their vulnerability will somehow decrease over time, in fact, the Refugee Hosts project resonates with other research which highlights that vulnerabilities often increase over time precisely because structural features and structural factors have worsened significantly during that period. So if we think of the context in Lebanon, for example, this is a country that had already been hosting hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees since the 1950s, had experienced its own civil war, processes of internal displacement and external displacement, in addition to, of course, displacement from Syria since 2011. In turn, since March 2020, the country has been affected, as the rest of the world has, by COVID-19. And this has led to a variety of xenophobic and discriminatory responses by politicians and by different state actors, which have significantly worsened the situation for refugees in the country, whether Palestinian, Syrian, Iraqi, Kurdish, etc. And then on top of displacement from Syria, plus protracted displacement situations, plus the legacies of the civil war, plus COVID-19, in August 2020, Beirut suffered the massive port explosion, which had a blast radius of more than 10 kilometers, killed a large number of people, and effectively destroyed the large parts of the city, and in turn led to the relocation of medical teams and supplies from the north of the country to Beirut. This is then further worsened by the financial crisis evolving in the country, which means that as I speak now in September 2021, people have no water, no food, no electricity, no petrol, no medicine, etc. So this is an exemplification that vulnerability isn't necessarily because of displacement and that it doesn't necessarily reduce over time, but people have to navigate overlapping situations of precarity and an increase in vulnerability as time passes. But this doesn't mean that refugees necessarily stop and wait for external actors to provide assistance. And in Badawi refugee camp, for example, the Badawi Camp Cultural Club in North Lebanon started by producing and distributing information using their everyday networks. They also collected donations from refugees for refugees, building on the long history of refugee-led responses at different points of the year. So, for example, the Cultural Club had already been collecting and sharing food baskets for people to be able to break the fast during the holy month of Ramadan, and they extended that activity of food basket production, as it were, to collect resources for people affected by the COVID pandemic. A relational approach is really important on a number of different levels. Firstly, relating to interdisciplinary research. Secondly, relating to the relationality between different groups of people, whether they are refugees and their encounters and relations with hosts, or the relations between refugees themselves. And thirdly, the relationality that exists between different refugee situations, as it were. Exploring the echoes or the overlaps that exist between the different places that we've been doing research in and the different points in people's displacement journeys and displacement histories requires us to acknowledge that a particular refugee camp or a city or a town both embraces and embodies other cities, camps, towns across the region. So, for example, in Badawi refugee camp, Badawi is more than Badawi refugee camp in many regards. It's not just that Syria's Yarmouk camp is now within Badawi camp because the people from Yarmouk, or many people from Yarmouk, have arrived in and are now living in Badawi camp and have unfortunately also been buried in Badawi camp's cemetery. but it's also because camps historically which were destroyed in the Lebanese civil war, such as Tel Zatar camp, for example, has re-emerged within Badawi camp itself. So Tel Zatar was physically erased in the 1970s, and yet it continues to exist physically as well as metaphorically in Badawi refugee camp. And here it's not just memories of spaces such as Yarmouk, Tel Zatar or Nahar al-Barid camps that travel across time and space, nor merely the inhabitants of those camps that travel physically between and across such spaces, but rather camps themselves can be understood as travelling over time and space, including through the re-emergence of Tel Zatar within and as Badawi camp, and some may argue also the more recent arrival of Yarmouk camp in Badawi. So the presence, the absence and the trace of people and of different objects within, under and through and as camps like Badawi mark the overlapping histories and spatialities of displacement, which both define refugee-ness but also make the camp. Through their symbolic and their physical resonance, the destroyed camps of Yarmouk from Syria and Tel Zatar in Lebanon are more than physically within Badawi camp. They are the history, they are the present and their potential future of Badawi camp. So what we really see in our research is that our field sites, in inverted commas again, including Badawi camp and the Jebel al-Badawi neighbourhood, Irbid camp and the Irbid city itself, Jarash and Zarqa, all in Jordan, in addition to Beirut in Lebanon and Amman in Jordan, they can't be visited, seen, heard, photographed or written in isolation. Each of these places is by definition more than a camp, a town or a city. Each is a simultaneity. It is simultaneously a point of origin, a point of destination, a point of departure, a point of refuge, but also a place of violence. Each space is a multiplicity and is created through relationalities with other times and places, through the echoes and the overlaps with other temporalities, spatialities and materialities. And each person, but also each shadow, each wall, each curtain, each pigeon house, each electricity cable or each tombstone has a history and a place within these overlapping processes of displacement and hosting. And these are some of the intersecting processes that we have been exploring in the Refugee Hosts project. Humanitarian policy and practice often uses particular labels or categories to direct the way that they respond to particular refugee situations. And one of the, or two of the labels that are used, two of the categories that are used, are refugees on the one hand and hosts on the other. And these terms and categories are used as if they were two separate, clearly isolated, clearly defined categories of people. But what our Refugee Hosts research project really highlights is the extent to which hosts often have displacement backgrounds, and displaced people have often acted as hosts in the past and may still be acting as hosts today. But if you have a program or a policy which is only providing assistance to people identified by that agency or by that NGO as refugees, or programs only directed to hosts, then you fail to really acknowledge the multiple roles, the multiple situations that people can be in, and the extent to which it may be shared processes of hosting and of displacement which characterize both the agency and the needs and the needs for particular rights of the people living in that same space. So shifting the gaze away from relations between refugees on the one hand and citizens or states or institutions on the other enables us to focus more intently on refugee-refugee relationality. This might be a matter of identifying the ways that refugees themselves host other refugees, how they engage in different processes of what I call refugee-refugee humanitarianism, but also, of course, some of the tensions that arise between different groups of people who have experienced displacement. And sometimes these tensions and this animosity might actually be created by international or national responses which prioritize one group on the basis of their nationality, for example, over another. So a response, an NGO program or a UN program, for example, might only provide assistance to people who have Syrian nationality, but will not provide assistance to people who've been displaced from the same conflict, but who have, for example, Iraqi or Palestinian backgrounds. So here we see that an international project can create hierarchies between different groups of refugees, and this focus on refugee-refugee relationality must therefore always be undertaken within the contexts of structural inequalities as well, and how those inequalities are created by different forms of policies and programs.